Hello and welcome to the Diverse Bookshelf with me, Samia Aziz. On this show, I interview incredible authors doing a deep dive into important themes and issues while talking all things books. On today's show, I'm speaking with Kevin Jared Hosein about his novel Hungry Ghosts. Now, Hungry Ghosts is a remarkable novel set in the 1940s in Trinidad, following the story of two families vastly different from one another, but whose decisions and actions have devastating consequences. In his book, Kevin explores so much, from race, class, religion, wealth, and human dignity, to huge questions around one's pursuit of escaping the life we don't want to lead, whether we are the saviours in our own stories, and how the actions of one person or group of people can have long-lasting impacts on others, spanning generations. I'm so glad he's my guest today. Kevin Jared Hosein is a teacher and writer from Trinidad, where he lives and works. He won the Commonwealth Writers' Prize in 2018 for his story Passage, and he has written two novels for young adults, The Repenters and The Beast of Kukuyo. His first novel for adults, Hungry Ghosts, is set in 1940s Trinidad and concerns the wife of an overseer who goes missing and the attempts by one of his employees to move up in a highly stratified society. Hi, Kevin. Welcome to the show. Thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
And how are you?
I'm fine, thank you. More than fine.
Oh, good. So I'm really excited to have you on the show today. I can't wait to talk about your book, Hungry Ghosts. And, I hope that this will be a chance for me and for our listeners to get to know you a little bit as well. And so you've written this really sort of like very powerful, very stunning novel called Hungry Ghosts. But I want to know a little bit about your journey as a writer. Like, did you always know that you wanted to write? What has your journey been like up until this point?
What I first wanted to do was actually to program video games. And this was when I was about 9 years old or so. And moreover, it was like a certain type of video game I wanted to do, which was a role-playing game, kind of like Dungeons and Dragons. But I was deeply into the Final Fantasy series when I was a child. These games have very long campaigns with a lot of characters. So when I was around 9 or 10 years old, I used to have a sketchbook and used to write out the plots and the characters and the items and enemies and all the world's law of, some make-believe world, which would really just be amalgamation of stuff that I would have encountered during my childhood. But a lot of it would have been my own invention as well. And that's how it started. And I that sort of branched out because I realized now that if I wanted to create a video game, I had to learn how to tell a story because the types I wanted told they told very long stories. So that is actually what encouraged me to read because I didn't like reading a lot when I was young. And the more I got into reading, it branched off into different types of books. And I know it may sound stereotypical, but one of the books that actually kind of got me into writing was The Catcher in the Rye by J.D. Salinger. And it wasn't so much that, that I could relate to the character or anything. I think it was more the style. How the book was written is written in such a fluid, simplistic style, conversational kind of style. And there's something about that drew me into writing because in Trinidad, in the Caribbean where we grew up, writing is mostly seen as academic. And literature on the whole is just seen as something to do in school, is never really pushed as a hobby. And so when I saw this, and not that there's no literary merit to the Catcher in the Rye, it's just that it is a type of merit to it that wasn't taught to me in school. So it was kind of new to me when I read it when I was about 12 or 13 years old. And from then, I knew I wanted to create something, I wanted to create a book. And problem in the Caribbean is that there's no publishing. And because there's no publishing,
Mm.
there's no real push to become a writer unless you were to migrate, you were to go to the US or the UK. Even then, it'll be pretty difficult because it seems like everyone would be one step ahead of you. So it mainly remained in the backdrop of my life. I still write a lot, but in school I kind of got funneled into the sciences, and my university degree is in biology and environmental sciences. But it always, I attended workshops when I could, and any resources I could find online. I kind of, I kind of rummaged through those, and it only really began to seem real when I won the Commonwealth Short Story Prize in 2018. And from then I was approached by a literary agent. And, from there I could have actually, one of the novels that I was working on actually could have been a reality. I've published in the Caribbean before, but mainly how I had to publish in the Caribbean is that there would be like an opportunity, like there would be a competition where you could submit a manuscript and you
Mm.
would get your book published and get a 2,500 copy run. But it wouldn't be like traditional publishing as we know it. Why? So this Hungry Ghost is, I guess, one of my first widely published novels in that sense. So it was a topsy-turvy, zigzagging kind of career for me that mostly just went for I have to just find what I could just have to look for any opportunity to becoming focused after winning that competition and acquiring an agent. And so yeah, it started with one thing and ended with another.
That's a really interesting and really quite fascinating journey into writing and publishing. And I really love the fact that actually it was like games that got you into computer games that got you into writing. And as you were talking, I just had this sudden realization that that makes complete sense because a computer game in and of itself is a form of world building, and you have to have characters, you have to have locations, and you have to have some kind of plot or some kind of journey. And I just found it so profound because I had never before really made that link. And I think my idea of somebody that is like into development of computer games, for example, is someone that's like very kind of mathematical. They're like very strict on rules. They're really good at maths, maybe. And I just didn't really make the link between that and the same kind of creativity that writing requires. So I thought that was so wonderful. And I think your experience of ending up studying science is probably one that many people will relate to as well. But did that help you? That kind of, I don't know, some of the research that you may have come across or some of the skills that you honed while studying science, do you think that has impacted you as a writer or that it has informed that in any way?
I would say that there's always peripheral knowledge to be glimpsed from any field of study outside of directly studying literature. So, of course, like a lot of my work, even short stories, there's a lot of ecological aspects to it, whether it's description or even theory or metaphor. There's usually something to do with Trinidadian or Caribbean biodiversity or ecology in there because that's what I studied, and I think all of that work is deeply fascinating. And honestly, I would like to put it to at least some use that those 4 years in university would have, I could put that knowledge somewhere. So they, they end up in my stories. And yeah, you're right in saying that world building is something that I would have learned pretty early on while trying to make these or devise these video games. And so yes, I used to just have scrapbooks of these things. And one thing that, not all games would get this right, but if you're doing like a long campaign, you would be learning like a bunch of stuff like pacing or removing continuity errors or ensuring that there's consistency in the landscape and characters. And when it comes to sciences, when it came to that, there's like yes, there's a mathematical aspect to it and theoretical and practical. There's also the sense that a lot of scientists were once inspired by literature. So, for example, like if I was to read The Origin of Species by Darwin or The Voyage of the Beagle, the language in that is not cold at all. It's actually quite descriptive and often poetic, and is you could tell is informed of the literature of its time. Even poetry, the structure, the typical structure as we know it, like how they're written in stanzas, line by line, programming code, which I think Charles Babbage is who, he structured programming code after poetry. So, you could think of that code as very long, verse poems. And so in my mind, I mean, of course, there's a distinction between the two, but the line becomes very, very blurred when you see that how inspired science is by literature and the ideas behind it, and how each one taken as could be taken as metaphor for parts of the bigger world or parts of the soul in a sense. So there's also the fact that I think if I actually did study literature, which I didn't get to do because my school didn't offer it at the time, I honestly I probably might not have been a writer because it's how I think how it's treated here. Like so academically I might have been turned off by it. So it's probably worked better for me as a hobby that, eventually evolved into a career rather than, one straight line as a field of study and then it's a career.
That honestly, listening to you talk about that was just really quite beautiful and really very like moving, because I think you're right in that the connection between the natural world and literature and also like philosophy, for example, it's so deeply intertwined. Like so much poetry is inspired by the structure of flowers or like like geometric designs and those kind of things. Like there's a lot of sort of complexity that shows how the two are really intertwined. And maybe if you are a writer, that connection with one's environment and the natural world is very, very important. And again, I think studying literature is amazing. And, I've been reading my whole life, but if you only read and you don't yourself experience or you don't yourself interact with the world, I think it really skews your perception and you miss out on something really profound. So yeah, I really loved hearing you talk about that. But I want to move on a little bit and talk about Hungry Ghosts, which is your latest piece of work, a really, really stunning novel. If you could just introduce the novel, just tell us in a few lines what it's about.
Okay, so Hungry Ghosts is set in 1940s Trinidad, which is a country that is unfamiliar to a lot of people and is a time that is unfamiliar to even people in the country. So we get an extra niche here into this. But what is particular, what is specific to that time and in the island of Trinidad at the time was that there were two superpowers on the island. There were the British because of colonialism, because we had sugarcane, and the Americans were there because it was at the time of World War II, which would have been like the early 1940s or so, and they spotted Nazi boats in the Caribbean Sea. So at the time, the Americans had come and they had marched out one of the seaside villages at gunpoint, and they had set up a naval base there. So there were American soldiers on the island at the time with British bureaucrats. Now, this was also after a series of labor riots, which would have started the end of colonialism in Trinidad. So the British were also sort of loosening their grip on the island at the time. If you were to understand the psyche of the Trinidadian, they always saw the British as quite powerful. But now that the Americans were here, they brought with them a sort of recklessness in a way. They brought with them the American dream, a sort of ambition. So the story is about two families, and the first family is a husband, Dalton Chango, and his young wife, Mali, and they live in a mansion atop a hill. And Dalton goes missing, like just at the beginning of the novel. What seems to be ransom notes start showing up, and Mali is unwilling to pay those ransom notes because she believes that her husband has is involved in some deep criminal pockets, basically. And at the bottom of the hill, the estate is a barrack, which is a structure of described of rot and rust, and that has little to do to keep out the elements such as rain and scorpions and snakes. And there are five families living within the barrack. One of those families are the Sarups, and we follow that family. Hansrat Sarup, Shweta Sarup, and their son Krishna Sarup. Hans works for the Changos. Somali hires Hans as a night watch because there's been some freaky occurrences that's happening in the mansion since the husband has disappeared. Hans wants to buy a house in the neighboring village so he could get the family out of the barrack. So he takes this dangerous job with this wealthy woman, and it seems that they've struck up something that is more than a friendship. So, and because of that, there's disastrous consequences to what's following. In a nutshell, it's about two families, one very wealthy, one very poor. One of them is in danger from criminal elements. The other one wants to get their family, into somewhere better. So all of them is in want of something, but it is exploring these characters we get to explore the psyche of Trinidad and that particular time.
So, why did you decide that you wanted to set this book at in this particular time? Because I mean, you mentioned that even people within Trinidad don't know much about that time, the 1940s. What was it about this specific time that appealed to you to set this story
What
in?
what appealed to me was actually one of the things was kind of a challenge because there's there wasn't much literature at the time that was written, that was written back then. And what's funny is that even though I was sort of building the world of this novel through research and interviews and photographs and recordings, I didn't think of it like not once when I was actually writing it did I think of it as historical fiction. And it's only actually when the book on the pre-publishing buzz, journey of the book, I saw it starting being billed as historical fiction, and I didn't that like for me it wasn't that, but I mean it is historical fiction. If you was to put it on a shelf, it has to be that. It wasn't to actually explore that particular time. Like what I was thinking is, it was more to explore. Yeah, so what I wanted to explore with it was actually the story of a story what my grandfather told me and how village life was for him back then. He would have been like a teenager back then. And he was telling me about it, and I was originally writing an article about forgotten rituals in villages in Trinidad. So I went to him to, because there's a lot of things in that village that I grew up in that are sort of like vestigial organs of that village. They kind of left behind. And I wanted to know, how do these traditions die? So as I was interviewing him, I got all these stories, and I realized that a lot of these stories I'd never heard before, like I'd never read in a history book. because a lot of it was kind of just orally told and stuck in memory. I wanted to kind of play with that, like how I realized that the mindset of of the islander, of the Trinidadian back then during colonial times, that it is in a way vastly different from now. And in a sense, there are some aspects that have stuck around. And it was more that I wanted to explore. I also wanted to explore that the sense of the idea that a single decision made by an ancestor could cause a ripple effect through the descendants down the line. So, for example, in Hungry Ghosts, in Trinidad, you if you were living in a barrack, you had a choice. You could stay in that barrack, or you could purchase land in a nearby village. You could also be chosen not to be paid in money, but to be paid in alcohol. So there were some people that back then that made that decision to be paid in alcohol, which meant that they didn't have any money to to buy a house in the village. And the family, the Sarups that live in the barrack, their ancestors chose to be paid in alcohol instead. So that sort of was it kind of sealed the fate of the families down the line, down the family tree. And it was something like that I want to explore. The idea of split second decisions or like a single decision causing such a great impact, not just in one's own life, but the lives around everyone around you. And your children, your grandchildren, your great grandchildren, because even today some people are in the same situation based on just one decision. And yeah, it was kind of that I wanted to explore. So a lot of the novel is based around the decisions of characters, very important decisions that don't seem important at the time.
Absolutely. And I think just reading the book, one of the striking things about the story and kind of the setting that you create is just how divided the society is. So not only do we have this difference in wealth and class, but we have the issue with like different religious groups and backgrounds and communities. And obviously like you also tackle generational age differences as well. The difference, I think, in sort of class and also when it came to religion, I think it gave me a lot to think about in terms of colonial and imperial rule, how so much of colonial rule was about divide and rule, that it's easier to rule over a country that is divided, where the people are not getting on, than it is to actually rule over a people that are united, because we know that people that are united are stronger. And I just wondered if that kind of like if that is just like my reading, or what your take
No,
on that is.
you're definitely on the nose there because there's a term I guess I kept in mind, which is lateral discrimination. Is it's not top down discrimination. It's not like one is even economically economically more advantaged than the other. It's that
Mm.
sometimes your neighbors and discrimination happens right there. And there has been a history of division due to colonialism in the Caribbean because they never wanted us to get along. When the enslaved were brought here from Africa, and they of course they brought them by force, and when and they were like that for many decades. So they had them enslaved, and then when slavery was abolished, the British decided that the sugar industry has to continue. So they said that we need to get indentured laborers from India, so which would have been my ancestors. And the Indian population in the Caribbean is pretty small. Most of the Indian population is in the southern Caribbean, which is in Trinidad and Tobago and Guyana. But in Trinidad and Tobago is about half the population. But you wouldn't really find um, much East Indian descent people in other Caribbean islands. So so those would have been my ancestors that would have come from India. So when they came, they didn't want the formerly enslaved the Africans mixing with the Indians. They didn't want them talking at all. They want them to get ideas. In fact, there was a festival called Muharram or Jose, we call it in Trinidad. And this would have been in the late 1800s, where for festivals, that was like the one thing that people had. They kind of brought people together to celebrate. And this particular one, had Indians and Africans both celebrating. And the British basically said, the festivals be shut down. We can't have you all doing this. And because the festival went on, they actually brought in infantry and massacred a lot of people at the festival, and is not something that's generally well known in Trinidad, but is actually because of that. That is actually kind of what sparked labor riots later on. Yeah, they didn't want us getting along, but some of the divisions we created ourselves with the help of the British. I'll give you an example. One of the things that the elders I wanted to know from the elders of the village that I grew up in around that time was how was school for you, because school was sort of a trade in a way. When I say a trade, it meant that you had to trade in your religion to attend a missionary school. Schools were mainly run by Canadians or the British. And in order to join what we would say is a good school, one with resources anyway, you would have to convert to Christianity. So you can be Hindu, you can be Muslim, at least at the school. And there were a lot of perks, to be into the school. You'd have upward mobility, for example. When it came to that, that was division right away, because then caused uh, that then caused a schism in the East Indian community, where you had people who were willing to convert to Christianity so that their children could go to a school with resources, to those that were unwilling to do so. And their children had to be educated in what we would call cow sheds, basically in the outside, not with professional teachers or with resources. And immediately you would have people who would say, you should sacrifice your religion for the future of your child. So, in a sense now, when I was talking to one of the elders, he said that school was really good for him. When he was here in missionary school, it was great. And because of how we would think is that, as a brown skin or dark skinned child going to school with white teachers, you would think that they would be flogged or beaten often. They said, no, no, it's good. They got presents all the time. I was Because it was kind of like a gentle persuasion to keep in that faith. Because, Christianity is the great thing that will give you all these. So, of course, it would be like that. So when colonialism was coming to an end, there was a transfer of power from the missionary schools. So you no longer had white teachers, but now you had brown teachers and black teachers. And he said that that's actually when problems began with the school, because the the children and the families, the parents of those children, did not respect the brown teachers and the black teachers the way they did the white teachers. So that something about that amused me in a way, because in a sense we sort of became our own enemy. Even after the British were gone, the divisions were already set up. So when I was writing Hungry Ghosts, I didn't want to go the route to have like any British characters in there. So there's no white British characters in there. There's no bureaucrats or anything like that. There's just that schism. There's the people who just do not, they're just that division between the two, where you have ones who would have converted to Christianity, and then you have the ones that would have remained in their religion. and the Christians did not want the Hindus and the Muslims moving in because it would actually drive down the property value of the village. I thought that that was much more fascinating to explore than just direct, I guess what you would call direct racism.
Hmm. Absolutely, and I think it's such an important reminder in understanding like how deep rooted some of these schisms that are sort of caused or exacerbated by colonialism, how deep rooted they are, that countries, even now, decades on, many countries around the world are still dealing with these issues, are still fragmented. And then as a result, it's not just about kind of like how polite people are with each other, right? It runs so much deeper and it's so much bigger that impacts like poverty levels and economic success or not of the entire country. Like it's just very, very complex. So when it came to writing Hungry Ghosts, for you, where did the story of these two families really originate from? Because I know you mentioned that you did interviews and you've done a lot of research. How did you decide that this was the particular story of Marley and of Hans that you wanted to tell?
So there's the story of the Chango house, Dalton and Molly Chango, who lives in the mansion. There's a village that's about a 15-minute drive from my home, and the name of that village is Freeport. And there was a guy who lived there, but he would have existed back then. And the house was actually and I based the Chango estate, the mansion, after the house that guy owned. So that guy was actually a Scotsman named Norman MacLeod, and he was proper mad. So what happened with him was that he was actually a Nazi sympathizer, and he lived there in this huge house, and he didn't really have any family. He didn't have anyone to pass on this legacy, these riches to. So he was in constant search of a child in the village that he could adopt in a sense, even adopt against their own will and pass on these belongings to. And eventually he did pass it on to, I think, the daughter of his gardener. And there was something about that guy because he actually kept icons and paintings in his house that he used to talk to. And he used to communicate with spirits and so on. So as I said, he wasn't all there in his head. There was something about the mystery of that this someone just from this impoverished village could acquire all of that wealth in such a short space of time, in such an insane sense too. Because when this little girl got this house, basically, the house got run into the ground because nobody knew how to take care of it. Everyone was fighting over rights to the house. And eventually, the house just went into disrepair and ruin, and now it's no longer there. And it is an enthralling piece of history that is not really no anywhere around anymore. So that was one of the first things I had in my mind when it came to it. It was the acquisition of riches through some, I don't know, through some underhanded sense in a way. And that's how, that's how the Changos came to mind. Because don't want to get too much into it, but with Marley, she marries Dalton when she's very young. She's pretty much still a child. And as a result, now she acquires all of these riches, and we learn that she's from a very tragic background that involves the American soldiers. And we learn that she's pretty much homeless at the time, and she made that decision to marry this man. Even she's a child, I guess. But now she's in a gilded prison. She's in a gilded cage with basically a madman in the house. So she's found herself in a whole other conundrum other than poverty. When it came to the Sarups who live in the barrack, this, as it is, very rudimentary structure, less than ideal living conditions. I was reading about it, and I was reading about what I would say would be honor killings that would have happened in a barrack, because which is not any novel, because I thought that would be, there's already so much in the novel that I didn't want to throw that in there as well. But it said that because men would frequently die of diseases when they go out there, would die of violence, sometimes just some petty squabble over cards, that their wives would be left alone, in the barrack. They would be unprotected from all the other men in this one building. And there would also be the case where, they would think that because there's so many people in the building and everyone's so squashed together, that there would be rumors of infidelity with wives, and thus would follow, beatings and tragically honor killings. And there was something about that lack of privacy. And I was thinking about, what if there was, like, and I mean, this does happen today. What if there were 25 or 30 people just living in my house? And all of a sudden I was being accused of all these things that, of course, there's just no barrier between the families. And there's no barrier. And I was thinking, how would it be for a child to grow up in that? Would he just want to drop out of society? And thus was born the character of Krishna, who is kind of stuck in the society that he doesn't want to be in, and so sort of goes out into the wild with some of his friends. And it's a strange coming of age thing I was thinking about when I was writing this.
It's just such an interesting story because it poses so many questions about sort of like the choices that we make, about the roles that we take on in life in our families, about the relationship between parents and children, but also the expectations that children have of their parents and what happens when they do or they don't fulfill that in one way or another. But also kind of like, how do you escape a life that you don't want to live? That we are all, so much of our lives is completely out of our control because of the circumstances and the location within which we're born. But what do you do if, especially as a child, like if you're so helpless and you know that right now there isn't a huge deal that you can do really to build the life that you want to build? So there's all these really interesting questions that you raised that I feel like almost like haunted me while reading and since then as well. But what I found interesting while reading the book was that almost all of the characters are somewhat morally ambiguous. In a lot of stories, we clearly have like a good person and then we have a villain, or we might have like a savior character, but we always know that there's like one person who is kind of all bad, or like they're bad but there might be like a little bit of good, but we kind of know that they're a villain. Now in Hungry Ghosts, I think what you kind of bring out is that there's good and bad in all of us, and so much of that is about the choices that we make and the way that we interact with people and the values that we hold. But what was really behind your decision about having this moral ambiguity, if indeed that is how you wrote it and not just me reading it, and not kind of clearly defined good people and bad people?
Well, when it came to that, I mean, the characters are definitely morally ambiguous, because a lot of them do start out a certain way, and you end up thinking of them a
Mm.
completely different way by the end of the story. And one of the characters that I was playing with this, playing with this idea, was Marley. And Marley is sort of a litmus test when it comes to readers, because typically when I go to book clubs, or people speak with me reading the book, it seems that there's a very clear divide. Some people actually love this character, some hate this character. And I find that fascinating, because there's in a way, we start off with her. She's very brave at the beginning. She's very rebellious and she's a heroine.
Mm.
And we learn about her backstory. And we follow her and we see her almost like we know that she's not really a savior, but other characters see her as such. We know that she has ulterior motives, and it's kind of like following a friend that is very convincing. It's the same with Hans, and Hans is seen as this do-gooder, noble, patriarchal character who seems, a bit overconfident, but not really arrogant. He's willing to sacrifice a lot for his family. But, how much is he really willing to sacrifice? And when does that actually start to hurt the family? So when, but what I wanted to explore was that I wanted them to feel like friends that you were following at first. I wanted you to be enamored with them and you were walking with them. You're like, yes, we're going with them. And then it's kind of like when you're with a friend and they suddenly make a very bad decision. I said, this is a book about decisions. And it's almost a decision that they can't take back. And you ask yourself, do I still want to be friends with this person? Do I still want to keep them close to me at least? Or should I distance myself from them? And the book almost does that, or the reader might do that because the book does distance themselves from some characters at a point. And Shweta, who is Hans's wife, may come off, and she's described as a difficult wife at first. She may come off as a bit nagging and annoying, and then we realize she might have a point in with Hans because she's complaining that she wants to get out of the barrack, and because it's full of holes, it's leaking, it's flooded in the barrack every time rain falls. And Hans doesn't seem to be doing anything about it. He doesn't seem to be serious about actually getting a house in the village. In fact, one of the first things he does in the novel is to buy some silicone cork to plug up the holes in the bark. It's almost like putting band-aids on wounds and not really treating the infection. And as the story goes, we see how difficult it is actually for Shweta to manage life and her resources and her child in the barrack. And what we what we probably previously would have thought as difficult or annoying or nagging, we see that she actually has reasons to be this way. And Hans, that the qualities that we found in him, that he likes to do good, he likes to help people. We see that this is massively to the detriment of his own family. And can't explore things like that without making them morally ambiguous. So I always, keep this idea in my head that characters don't have to be likable. So I don't worry about characters being likable. You can trick readers into them being likable, but they don't have to be objectively likable. I think they just have to be interesting. And you in the end, the all the reader have to do is care what happens to the character. No matter how the character is or their behavior, the reader just has to be able to care what happened to the character and the people around.
Mm. So Shweta, oh my gosh, I really felt for her. Like I really felt for her because I know what it feels like when you really hope that you're on the same page as your family or your partner, your husband, whoever it may be. You really hope that you're on the same page and you both want to get somewhere, you want to do something, you want to move. In her case, she's so desperate to leave the barracks, understandably so, because it is not a nice living environment, and she wants to build a better life for her son, essentially. To feel like actually maybe your husband is actually okay, like he's not motivated enough, he's not driven enough, and he's not understanding your desperation in wanting to leave the situation. But also I think if you are so closely linked to somebody that doesn't hold that same drive as you, that can be really difficult. Like it can really bring in some major holes and gaps within your relationship, because you just feel like these are fundamental things about the life that we want to live, and we're just not on the same page about it. On Marley, still feel, I read the book a while ago, I still feel very conflicted about her. I have very mixed emotions about this character. She did manage to build a life outside of what was sort of like expected of her. But she's a very complicated character. There are many layers to her, and there's times where you kind of feel like she's like hurting too many people, or then there's times that you feel like she's hurting herself. It's very, very complicated. But what I think I was pleasantly surprised about throughout the book was the complexity with which you wrote female characters. And when the book opens, it opens with this scene of four boys making a blood pact together. And so I did wonder how much of the book was going to be about male friendships. But at the heart of your novel, you actually have very strong female characters. And I just wonder what drove you to do that. Why did you make that decision, and what the process was like for you as well to make sure that these women were so multi-layered and complex.
The Caribbean is quite a matriarchal society. So
Mm.
there's yeah, typically like when you have, yeah, the men may bring in the money, but the women are the ones who will be the advice givers anyway. They are the ones who in terms of, I mean, it's been changing, but in terms of how society was and probably has always been since, let's say, 100 years or so in the Caribbean, probably more than 100 years. It's mostly been matriarchal. You would hear, you would mostly be communicating with your aunties or your nanny, which would be your grandmother, women of the village. It would actually be who let's say the children who would be close to. The men would actually be quite distant, not financially, but emotionally. Of course, there are a lot of men who absconded their families as well, had multiple families, and so there's that sense. So when I was thinking about it, and I was thinking about like the barrack itself, and just about the Hindu religion, and I grew up in a Hindu household. I myself am not. But my family, some of my family is Muslim and some are Hindu. I grew up in a Hindu house because my mom is Hindu. And there's something that she would say when it comes to the religion, and that the key term, a word that you have to keep in mind with that, is devotion. And not so much worship. So like with Abrahamic religions or Christianity, you'd worship a god. He says, she says, it's not so much about that. It's more about the internal self, where you don't need a massive structure to worship. You don't even need statues, or you sometimes you may not even need the religious text. He said that one of the key tenets is that the Hindu deities is that they're all part of one, and each one they wear different hats, and they each represent something different. So like you have they represent death or fertility or wealth or luck, fortune, and so on. And you would devote yourself to like a certain part of your house, certain portion of the day, a certain part of your life. And this could just be simply sweeping the front of your house in the morning, making sure that that little area is clean, or tending to a small garden in a barrel, that you keep in a halfway sliced barrel. So it's, and she's like that. It focuses on that, the qualities that you can attain just by maintaining these, what would seem insignificant aspects in your life. But say all of them add up. So you devote yourself to something. And I was thinking about female figures in a society, and a lot of it deals with devotion to family, devotion to spouse. And I wanted to lend a certain strength to that. And when it came to the female characters, I envisioned some of them as being future versions of other characters. So Lata, for example, who is a girl who lives in the barrack, she wants to marry a boy from the village who has money so that she could gain some upwards mobility. And that would make her very much different from Mali. Um, Shweta seems very steadfast with her religion and is also interested in the older ways of the more ancient ways of Hinduism. Who there's an elderly woman in the back named Rukmin who deals with these older aspects of Hinduism. And I see Rukmin sort of like a future version of Shweta. So there's these senses of that decisions can eventually transform one character eventually probably into another character.
Mm. That's really fascinating. And I just loved that difference that you spoke about between worship and devotion, just like on a very personal kind of internal level as well. And I know that you wanted to call the book Devotion, if I'm not wrong.
Yeah,
But
that's right.
yeah, but you were not able to do so, and you called it Hungry Ghosts. But I do really like the fact that there is this possibility that kind of characters some characters echo other characters, or show the possibility of what may happen to a character if they make certain decisions, or if things carry on going the way they are, or not otherwise, or otherwise. I find that so fascinating, because it's kind of sometimes in anger you may say to somebody older than you, like, I want to do this thing because I don't want to end up like you. I've just thinking back to, like, maybe much younger versions of myself saying it to my mother or my aunt or my elder sister, like, well, no, of course I'm going to go here. I'm not going to do what you're telling me to do because I don't want to be like you. And there is that sense that an understanding that, like, the choices you make can result in a life that you may not want to lead, or you right now you see as being entirely not good or not fulfilling. But again, like, I just, it's heavily, life is heavily complicated. And I read this article actually where you had spoken about when you were a teenager, you were most interested in ideas around revenge, salvation, and madness. And I think there are elements of that still in your writing today. But I just wondered if you could unpack that a little bit, but also maybe talk about the ideas that drive you and your writing today, and some of those that we see in Hungry Ghosts.
So let's start with the idea of revenge, where and something that you would have touched on, like where you in anger you would say, I, I hope I'm never like you, and I think of Krishna in that way, Hans's son. So Krishna, in a sense, sees how his father has to grovel to people in order to get anything. They go to a store and they're immediately discriminated against, and Hans basically has to beg to stay in the store. Krishna doesn't understand why there's other people in the store. Why do we have to beg just to buy an item in the store? And he sees himself as he doesn't want to become like that. And how does he escape that fate? Does he try to change it from the inside? Does he try to change himself? And his decision is just to drop out of society and to go with these boys. And there's also two characters I didn't speak about is the twins and Rudra and Rustam, and they are friends of Krishna, but they are also the sons of a notorious mass murderer who the character inspired by that person is a real person and was actually worse than was depicted in the book. And the real guy, probably killed upwards of 400 people or so. And I would say the body count of the character in the book, the twins' fathers, let's say, is maybe a little less than that. But, everyone knows the twins, Rudra and Rustam, as the sons of a mass murderer. And they seem very much inclined to violence because of, basically living with their father. And their father would have taught them to, how to kill animals and so on. And they were just raised in violence. And there's points where they do enact violence on bullies from the village. But there's a point in the story, not gonna say which point, but there's a point where they could they could very much enact revenge on a certain character. They could kill this character, and they don't because they decide that that would that would sully their name, and that would perpetuate the cycle of revenge and violence. And it was it was that idea as well. A lot of these characters just want what they feel is right for them. They just want what they feel they deserve, and they make decisions to acquire what they deserve, whether it is hurting someone else or getting revenge on someone else. And some of the male characters in the book, they avoid violence, but they have no choice but to play along with it when it comes to them. So when it comes to like ideas of revenge, that's there. And I know, like, maybe as my teenage self, the book, as violent as it is now, it probably would have been much more violent and much more revenge filled. But I think I've learned to to see, as time went by, becoming an adult, and many years after that, I I'll tell like a personal story with it. So I have a dog, and well, I have three dogs, and one of them escaped from the yard one day, and it's small dogs. So she's a small dog, and she doesn't really pose any threat. She's not violent or anything, but of course, outside I wouldn't know that. So she went into the road, and there's this grandfather, and I'm assuming, his granddaughter, very young girl, and he tells his granddaughter to pick up this stone and haul it at the dog. So she tosses the stone, it connects to the dog, and of course hits my dog. And I'm livid. I'm pretty pissed at the time. I don't do anything. I take my dog and I go back home. I treat her the wound. And I was thinking at the time that yes, me and my dog, we are victims in this story. But if we were to flip it and look at the grandfather's point of view, he was the victims in that story, and he is the hero. He saved his granddaughter from what might be a rabid dog. And that's how he would tell the story. And I was thinking of that when I was writing these characters. How would they tell their own story? They don't see themselves as bad. We may see them as bad, um, or doing bad things, but they see themselves as doing the right thing, as things that would salvage themselves or salvage their families, or create a world of safety, a barrier around them. So yeah, when it comes to themes of salvation, there's that. Sometimes you could be saving somebody, you could just be ultimately be harming them. Or sometimes like an act of destruction is an act of salvation in someone else's mind. And yeah, with such a large cast of characters, I was able to explore that. And yeah, so I mean, I think this is a book that if I was 10 years younger, so it would have been written a lot differently. But especially when it comes to impoverished characters, I think there's always a risk of exoticizing poverty, which I didn't want to do. But there's also the risk of making them too helpless in a way, because or just making them stereotypically poor. I wanted to give the sense of ambition, because that's how people in the barrack were. No matter what their living circumstances were, they always devoted themselves to something. They always, even when I was hearing stories about a guy who lived in a barrack who was a film projectionist, and he used to take the film posters, and decorate his, that tiny little living space with film posters, and it's like almost as if to say that, this filthy, diseased place could be, for 1 second, could probably be called a home. So I that's what I was keeping in mind with it, that everything has these extra dimensions to it.
Yeah, oh my gosh, I think it's so important, the reflection on the stories that we tell ourselves and like the perspective from which we look at things. And sometimes it makes me think like, is there an objective right or wrong? Is there an objective good or bad? If there's always going to be a different way of looking at things, I think fundamentally, I think there is, but I think that kind of the way in which sometimes your circumstances also then lead you to do things that if you were in a different circumstance, you wouldn't be doing those things. But the story or your experiences are still kind of driven by a goodness or saving yourself or saving somebody else. And I thought that the exploration of poverty in the book was so well done, because the thing you really brought out was this sense of agency, which sometimes in descriptions of poverty or like poor communities, we don't see enough of. We don't see enough of the kind of everyday decisions that people make, the choices they make, the ambitions that they have. Like, it's not just like static communities. These are still people that are living their everyday lives, that are, also like there's future generations to think about. They have places they want to go, things that they want to do. And I thought you honestly, like, there was such a nuanced description and such a nuanced presentation of that class, which gave me so much actually to reflect and think about as well, because it was like a very intimate portrayal. I don't know how you did it so kind of intricately, but honestly, it was really, really good. I know that we are running short on time, so I'm just gonna ask you a final couple of questions. Um, with Hungry Ghosts, what have you really hoped that those that pick up the book will take away from it?
I was hoping that you would take away from it. I always wanted to just write this story that would be like a portal into the darker parts of the Caribbean. And I am hoping that it would give you an idea of a different perspective of the Caribbean, and that it would encourage you to pick up more Caribbean literature. Because I see it as, one great tapestry, one connecting thread, one to the other. So that's, what I'm hoping for, that it would boost Caribbean literature in a way, that it would encourage you to be like, okay, maybe I like this, I'll check
Mm.
out some other things.
Mm. Absolutely. And so, you mentioned a few times about the kind of research process that you undertook and how some of the places in your novel are inspired by real life places and characters too. But when you were researching and also putting the novel together, did you discover anything that was particularly shocking to you?
But I was like, okay, so like during research, I said like, as I had mentioned before, the aspect with schools, because I always thought it was much different when
Mm,
having white teachers. I didn't know. She said that really when beating and flogging and corporal punishment kind of really launched and took off was when brown and black teachers came.
mm,
Because when they came, that was how they forced students to respect them. Because students didn't just naturally respect them, like how, you would give to the British, the whites. And now you had to be beaten to be taught respect. And in a sense, that is a microcosm of a lot of Caribbean culture nowadays when it comes to how parents decide to discipline their children, but also even down to how offices are run in the Caribbean and Trinidad. There's still a lot of this bureaucracy in place. So just brief example, there was this lady who she went to the a ministry building in Trinidad, and her shoulders were exposed, and they told her that you couldn't come in with your shoulders exposed. And is weird to have that rule today that was probably there from since, British colonialism. There's also that you cannot wear cargo pants or short pants when you enter a government building. So you cannot wear cargo pants or short pants when entering a government building, which is crazy because this is a tropical climate.
Yeah.
You're sweating a lot, it's hot. You can't be expected to just be wearing suits all the time in the hot
Mm,
sun. So when it came to seeing how, okay, this is kind of how we became our own enemy, and I think the schools was something that sort of brought it home to me that yes, we did not know how to respect each other. And we're
mm,
still learning how to do that today. And because Trinidad is quite a heterogeneous society. There's many different religions, especially when compared to the Caribbean, where it's not predominantly Christian. There's Hindus here, there's Muslims, Christians, many branches of Christianity. So there's not just Africans here. We have Syrians, we have Chinese, we have East Indians, and we have a lot of Venezuelan migrants that are here, and we're still learning to try to get along. So I think the thing with the schools is was like a perfect microcosm for that.
oh my gosh. I mean, I'm really quite shocked myself by everything that you just said because it feels so bizarre to know that there wasn't kind of that corporal punishment when there were only white teachers. And it was the introduction of, I guess, like your own people anyway, that kind of it just brought this huge change about, which again, we've talked about it. It's just this like really awful impacts of colonialism that around the world millions upon millions of people are still dealing with. But you know what, Kevin, this has been so insightful, so interesting. Thank you so much for your time today. And I really hope that more people do pick up Hungry Ghost because there's just so much to explore. And I think we could keep talking for hours more. But thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Kevin, for such an insightful, interesting, and really illuminating conversation. I really enjoyed it. If you enjoy the podcast, please follow the Diverse Bookshelf on your podcast platform of choice and connect with me on social media. I'd love to hear from you. I would really appreciate it if you could rate and leave a review as it helps more people find the show.